and an explanation. So we can explain why we did this. We understand why we did this, but we did it. And I think it was not until I really came to terms with that aspect. I mean, it was easier to come to terms with being victimized, but it was when I had to come to terms with what I did to others, is when I really feel like I left. You know, and it seems like somehow it gets, maybe this is a challenge, but it gets put under the rug a little bit. I mean, all four speakers who were, you know, really brave, wonderful souls, all had in their talks examples of doing terrible things. And it's, I think in the recovery, one has to really have to come to terms with that. That's, and it seems like it doesn't get enough, you know, so that's my first. Second question quickly is, and this one's not very challenging, in the process of treatment, this, I guess, goes to the last speaker. Not every, you know, a very small percentage of people who experience a traumatic event end up with PTSD. We know this.
Yes.
So what's the assessment process of determining, I'm not a therapist now, I'm a research psychologist. What's the assessment process of figuring out where the hell your client is at, so you can determine, you know, because they might not be full-blown PTSD, they might, you know, there's all kinds of levels of the impact of this. And when you talk about the treatment, I mean, you didn't have that much time, but what I didn't hear was, you know, how do you assess your client's situation? You can determine the right modality, the right treatment, so those are my comments.
Want to answer the second one first? Doesn't matter.
I can answer both. I think the first point you made is terrific, and one for us to be curious about, because I think that, yes, I think the first point you made is terrific and something for us to think about. Why didn't we talk about that? Because it is probably one of the most traumatizing things that can happen, right? You're absolutely right. The most devastating. Yes, I think you're on target. I think it's really interesting that we didn't talk about that.
Or that we alluded to.
That we alluded to. I think it's my own guess is that it's the most painful thing, and we didn't want to go there.
Shelley,
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. We had a minister from Rwanda come to one of our conferences, and one of the things that concerned him was the PTSD of the people who perpetrated atrocities,
Yeah.
the ones who hacked off heads and so on.
Yeah.
It was a trauma.
Yeah, I know, the worst. I know, I think you're absolutely right, Michael. Both Michaels. And so it's something for us to think about, right? In terms of assessing for PTSD, I go with the behavioral stuff. If someone is having a lot of addictive avoidant behaviors, if the level of dissociation, they're spacing out even in my office sometimes, being triggered into startle. I mean, I just stay with what they're experiencing in the world to the degree that their nervous system is reacting in these, you know, high up and low down ways. I'm trying to think of other ways, other things I think of, and the level of self-blame and you know, there is some there is some truth to what you're saying about perpetrating something, right? You did it, right? And you were, you know, as was it Schachter's studies about how vulnerable we are to authoritarianism and to acting evil with, you know, and Milgram, and to also acknowledge how vulnerable we are to follow orders. I think, you know, I think we're so vulnerable to following orders. Yeah. Does that make sense? Does that answer your? Yeah.
Yeah, William.
I mean, I think that's what people don't want to admit, that we're just so vulnerable to following orders.
I think another element of really coming to terms with the harm that I did to others is the shame involved. Because there's so much shame in having been conned, having been used, having fallen for this, you know, bag of tricks that was revealed over time. And there's so much shame that was used to control people, myself, control everyone that was in the group, that when you leave, you're struggling with a lot of shame. And so there's more shame for having done this to others. And I think that's part of what impedes it being just really opened up and, you know, dealt with, because it's deeply connected to the whole loss of your own agency in the whole experience.
And just one more thing about that. in terms of also recognizing the signs of PTSD, there are cases, and I'm sure you've seen this, Shelley, when somebody who's out of a cult is in fact not startled and not hyperventilating, and in fact is very matter-of-fact, very calm, and describing the horrific events in a very detached way. That's not uncommon, and that's a case of dissociation so deep that it usually takes a while. And as a therapist in that situation, when you talk about grief or rage, it's like you're talking in a foreign language that the patient has never even heard. So those feelings can take a long time to emerge. They do need to emerge in some form, maybe not the forms that we might know if you're from a neurotic Jewish family like mine, of everybody screaming and putting everything out there, but some form of these buried affects that have been so constricted while in the group will need to emerge eventually. Was there somebody here?
I just want to say one thing.
Wait for the mic. Yep.
You want the mic?
Oh.
Okay, it was just about that other question, that whenever anybody did anything that they realized afterwards was really bad to someone else, when they were doing it, they thought they were doing that person a really great spiritual favor. So it wasn't like they were doing it because they liked doing it. They really thought they were doing the best thing possible for that person.
Well, they also thought they were doing the thing that the leader would admire them for, and that the leader would be happy about. Of course, the leader would then turn around and claim they had never asked you to do such a thing. So.
I mean, if you're willing to do it to yourself,
But I think it's also a complex and nuanced issue. There are different circumstances in different people. And in terms of these papers, William spoke about the harm he did and how he felt in his paper, and I was very moved by that when I read it. And each of us touched on things, but I think in addition to what the last speaker mentioned, we do think we're doing something good. Each of us had different roles. I was, in effect, a teacher, inflicting what had been inflicted on me. Not everybody's in that situation. I don't know if Amy was exactly. But the other thing is, there's also a sense of aggrandizement in oneself. I thought I shared in this great wisdom that the rest of the world didn't know. Now, looking back, I can see that that wasn't the case. And now I do feel badly about some of the things that I did. And in fact, one of the first things I did after I got out was the few people I was still in contact with who had left. I went and said, "Oh my God, I am so sorry. How did I ever think that I knew what was right for you better than you knew what was right for yourself?" And I wrote a long letter to my graduating high school class, which I reconnected with 40 years later, apologizing for how I treated them. Some of them, one of them is here today, some of them came to me and said, "Listen, it's life. Don't feel so badly about it. This is a very good thing that you did, and saying what you did, move on. It wasn't your fault." So it's a complex issue, and I would just caution that we remember that.
No, of course I did. I mean, I talked a little bit about the one incident of the other apartment, but that was mild. That's part of the nature of these groups, is that we all become implicit in, the way that people are being mistreated. So, for example, I participated in throwing one of my, asking someone to leave from one of our apartments. This was a periodic thing that would happen in our group, where your therapist would say, well, so and so is really not a good influence in your apartment, and I really think that that this person should be asked to leave. And then someone else, your next roommate's a therapist would say the same thing, and you'd get together, and then eventually this person would be asked to leave the apartment. So yeah, I mean, I've also, like in that situation, I did contact the person after I left the group and asked her to forgive me. My brother, I didn't speak to him for years that I was in the group. And then when I left, I wrote to him and asked for his forgiveness. But there are people I'd still like to ask to forgive me for things I did there. I mean, so I think it's part of the healing process anyway. I think it's important to do that also because we all really have to do that. I mean, in a way, that's for all of us have to grow up in that way of realizing that we don't always do the right thing, and that we have to acknowledge that to each other.
Yes, I have a question about the twisted sexual ethics of cult leaders, because several of you talked about cult leaders who wound up having sexual relationships with underage or adult female followers. Yet at the same time, many of those cult leaders controlled the sexual and romantic lives of others. So I was wondering if some of you could comment on the psychological elements that enable a cult leader to do those type of disconvergent thinking and behaviors.
They're not disconvergent.
Yeah, you want to speak?
I just wanted to say that they're really not disconvergent.
Repeat the question?
I'm sorry. He was asking about the sexual activities of the leadership, meaning where on the one hand they can perhaps participate in sex with their members, underage women, adult women, or boys, depending on how it is, young men, and at the same time control the relationships of the membership, insist upon celibacy or whatever. So, and I was just trying to make a joke, really, but the fact is they're not at odds with each other, because the controlling of the sex lives and the intimacies of the membership is all about controlling their activities, keeping people at bay, keeping them on their defensive all the time, always keeping them questioning about what am I doing wrong, what do I have to do to please the leader. Those things, there has to be a very strict moral setup for that to work, and the leader can change that at any time, which also fits. Now, at the same time, the leader has drives, which become convenient. There are all these people ready to serve. So you translate that, the sexual activity with members, you translate that into I'm helping you go through a passage of purification, or I'm helping you go through a change you need to go through. But just don't tell anybody. It's really, in practice, it's not good. Just like it would be in any situation, it would not be good in any situation. But it gets fit into the big picture.
It's like after the guru molests you, he says, "You're welcome." Because as far as he's concerned, this is a gift, but don't tell anybody. Sort of like Stephen Colbert, character.
I just wanted to comment on the first question. Two things in terms of the nuances that were mentioned around not speaking out readily about one's own shame, about abuses in the role of, not the leader, but middle management, let's say doing it to the one underneath. I always call that middle management the capo level. In society, people aren't very open in general, so when cult members come back into society and they're socializing, they don't very readily see people being open on that level. So, it is easy. It's just important to also realize the layering that they're in therapy, but outside they don't necessarily see people being that open. The second thing is that it's particularly important or poignant with second generation if a second generation person is realizing, oh my goodness, this is what I've done. And the parent is still in and not recognizing it. So the agony of trying to feel like there's some possibility of having a relationship with the parent, but they're completely in denial about their own abuses. The adult child now.
Well, it's a good time to introduce Michael Langone, the Executive Director of the International Cultic Studies Association. Thank you for being here today, Michael, and for putting in I don't know how many decades of very hard work, pretty much single-handedly, to maintain an organization which basically is about it. It's about the only one in this country, for sure. There are a couple others in other nations, but here, this is what we've got, and it's a great resource. However, there is a great need for people who have been abused in cultic groups to speak out in a more active way about the problem and to raise public awareness. And this is obviously a mission of Michael's group. We all recognize that mission is out there. This is an effort in that direction. Did you want to say a word, Michael?
Well, I would say that we don't do anywhere near enough in preventive education. Our focus has more been on providing information.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just quickly, I also just think it's important for parents especially, but anybody, teachers, to talk about the issues with young people, especially with young people, and to point out when people, come around who seem to be a little bit narcissistic and ask questions about where the money's going and, if there's money being collected for a cause, who's using it, what's it going for. Just, to remain connected to your children and remain, and keep questioning or keep talking to them, of course. I mean, it seems obvious, so I assume you probably all knew that already anyway.
So thank you. We're going to wrap up for the day. Oh, I'm sorry, one more. Go ahead.
I just don't want to leave here without getting something out of this. I'm in a different situation than everyone here.
Yeah?
Actually, I have a son in a cult.
Yeah.
He's 20. And I want to...
I'm a very painful story, and I don't want to be insensitive, but we're going to close up this, and we'll talk afterwards about where you could go next with this. Okay?
There's plenty of people
There
here.
are people here who can point you in getting some more making more contact and getting some more help. So don't leave before we chat. So again, thank you everyone for your participation. And thank you to NIP, Michael Langone, Bill and Lorna Goldberg right next to him run a group for former members. Is it monthly also? Yes. And we are the ICSA sponsored monthly group is the last Friday of every month at the church St. Paul and St. Andrew on 86th Street at West End, 7 to 9 every Friday. Every last Friday of the month. So there's that, but also just a reminder that this is a phenomenon that I hope you become more familiar with by virtue of coming today. Many thousands of people, in fact, almost always in any random gathering of people you're in, there are people who've been affected by this, directly or they know someone. It's not uncommon. It's very real, and it's in our lives, and historically, many millions of people. So we just urge you to look further, check out ICSA, and thank you so much for your interest.
Continuing education.
Oh, thank you. Right. Paul has...
Russ.
I'm sorry, Russ. Russ has the continuing education forms for you, so make sure you see him before you leave.
And
Okay.
the evaluation.
And the evaluation as well. So the CEE forms and the evaluation. Russ can give you those before you leave. Okay. Thank you very much. And to our wonderful presenters.